thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you for your patience as we navigated the wait list and the seating. We had 100 RSVPs for this talk tonight, testament to a great interest in the work of Ann Blair, but maybe less turnout, testament to the colds and flus that are going around right now. So thank you while we worked all of that out. So tonight we're here to see Ann Blair deliver a talk on methods of collaboration among early modern humanists. Ann Blair is a Henry Charles Leah Professor of History at Harvard University, where she teaches early modern cultural and intellectual history, and with Leah Price, a recurring course on the history of the book. Also with Price, she has organized several conferences on at the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study, including the interdisciplinary Why Books in 2010, which I wish I could have attended, and last fall, Take Note, a conference on the past, present, and future of note-taking. And I should say that I believe both of those conferences were videotaped, and portions of them are available online.
That's great. Yes.
And tonight's talk, in fact, is also being videotaped and will be available in the future through the Columbia Center for Digital Research and Scholarship. A Harvard graduate herself, Ann Blair returned to Cambridge in 1996 as a professor of history and has had a distinguished and exciting career there. For the period 2009 to 2014, Professor Blair holds a Harvard College Professorship for Distinction in Teaching. Among many other honors, she is a recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, and in 2009 was elected to the American Philosophical Society. Her most recent book, Too Much to Know, Managing Scholarly Information Before the Modern Age, shows how much can be known about information management in the early modern period, and addresses the relationships between manuscript and print, reading and writing, text and paratext, and the organization of disciplinary knowledge from the late antique period to the Enlightenment. When it came out in 2010, it garnered popular as well as academic attention and a Choice Award for the best academic title. Today, Professor Blair will be giving a talk on a topic that comes up throughout Too Much to Know, that is methods of collaboration among early modern humanists. The talk will be followed by a short question and answer period and then a reception next door in 522. Thank you all for being here, and please join me in welcoming Professor Ann Blair.
Thank you so much, Carla, and all of you for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here, especially since I'm presenting work that's very much in the early stages, and I really look forward to your feedback. Basically, it grows out of the book that Carla mentioned, Too Much to Know, which was a study of printed Latin reference works and the way in which printing made it possible and made it necessary for them to grow in each subsequent edition, for example, as the book needed to appeal to more and more different kinds of readers. And what I noticed in each edition is that some people got acknowledged on the pages as the work grew in size, and of course many others didn't. So here is Polyanthea florilegium. Maybe we should dim the light slightly if possible so we get a better contrast. There are a lot of slides. And we can see this collection of sententiae, of quotables, basically, by authors from antiquity to basically through Boccaccio and Dante. And we can see Lang is very pleased to have renovated the book in 1604, whereas it's a 1503 first imprint. But nonetheless, he acknowledges the first author, Mirabelli, and then these two authors from the mid-16th century, and then we have additions by Sylvius. So we have a total of 5 names on this title page. And why those people, as opposed to others? Here is an earlier one, again with a few of those names added. Theodor Zwinger is the author of another massive reference book at about 1.5 million words, and none of these books get written by one person, but only his name is on the title page. Its sequel, though, has one name on the title page. Its sequel totals, I counted, estimated 10 million words, 8 folio volumes of 1,000 words apiece. One name on the title page, but inside, the compiler of this renovated theatrum, the theater of all human experience, names 5 people. He can't actually name them because he is Catholic and these guys are Protestants, but he talks about the 5 men who built this work, who laid the foundations, and that is actually the stepfather of Theodor Zwinger, who gave his notes to his stepson, as Theodor Zwinger acknowledges. Theodor Zwinger, the guy I just showed you, who wrote that first edition, and of course portrays himself in this memento mori way, as if conscious of having committed the act of hubris, like Bellerophon in the background. And then his son, who added an index, and then the printer and he himself. So in other words, these guys are portraying themselves at the end of a long collaboration over time, a diachronic collaboration. But each one of these volumes was also an act of collaboration by multiple people who are not mentioned anywhere. And those are the invisible helpers that I'd like to talk about mostly tonight. Theodor Zwinger mentions two people in his preface. He talks about my very dear cousin, whom he calls his sole helper, whom he used, quote, for 3 years to copy with a faithful and elegant hand and to glue things which needed to be put together. So we see one kind of helper is a family member, a young person who will presumably learn and be helped in his career by helping an older family member. Gluing is an activity that I talk about in Too Much to Know, is cutting and pasting from existing manuscript or print into little slips of paper that then get organized alphabetically, as is a practice of lexicography exemplified by the OED and before that by Samuel Johnson. So here it's being practiced in the 16th century. And here is an example of gluing by Ulisse Aldrovandi, who left hundreds of volumes of his manuscripts that are glued. And he is someone who, in one of his prefaces, thanks his wife for gluing things in the proper place. So we can see another kind, he doesn't name her, but we can see then another kind of family member being acknowledged for what's considered to be quite a mechanical job of gluing. We find a wife acknowledged in print by the son of Adrien Tourneb, who wrote another one of these gigantic collections of notes, basically. It's a posthumous publication that the son has taken on. He thanks two people, the author's wife, as in his mother, and his secretary, whom he names, Ioannis Fordinus. And this gives us an example then of another kind of relationship, the one I'll focus on today, of the amanuensis, the helper, who's presumably paid, and although I don't have much detail about that, and who has a very close relationship with a humanist. So the larger project is collaborative authorship. There are many forms of collaborative authorship in early modern Europe, obviously playwriting in the time of Shakespeare, novel writing in the French Salon, and collaborative work in the academies, whether literary or scientific academies. And I'm looking forward to trying to make comparisons between these different milieux, even as I focus on late humanist scholarship, basically. I think I have a unique acknowledgement of a wife in print. This is an illuminator of a 15th century, or actually, early 16th century choir book where he depicts himself and his name, Nicolaus Berci, Illuminista, and his wife, Margareta, supplying the comfort of a loving arm and some mead, I think. But mostly, of course, the problem is that these people are invisible. This is an example of an awareness of how little the original author in one of these long-running works counts at the end. A comment by Adrien Baillet in the late 17th century that the Calipino Dictionary, which is the best-selling dictionary, a Latin dictionary, which first published in 1503, and he's saying that at the beginning, in its original state, the Calipino was nothing, it was worthless. But so many people added so much to it over time that now nothing is left but the author's name and the title, Dictionarium, and yet it's obviously grown in quality. He's appreciating the change over time. So the kinds of collaborations that humanists engage in, as I mentioned, so is over time among peers. But here there's also synchronic collaboration. Humanists always thought of themselves as part of a republic of letters in a form of intellectual sociability carried out through travel, through epistolary exchange, through exchanging notes and books. And here's an unusual mention on the title page by a dictionary that's published with the Calipino. It's the Onomasticon of Conrad Gesner. This is a proper name dictionary, which is published as a supplement to the regular Latin dictionary. And you'll notice in this title page, it's dropped in later editions. He says that this dictionary has been, for the first time, compiled by Conrad Gesner and in part by his friends. So here he's sort of saying, this is, my friends and I have worked on this together. Of course, it's quite vague, and he does not specify further inside the dictionary. Conrad Gesner is someone who uses, in his other works, he's also a great compiler of the Historia Animalium, of natural historical information. And in those books, he thanks people by name for having shared information or specimens with him. And I think he's inviting people to contribute on the basis that they will get acknowledged in print if they do so. So he's showing that attitude from the beginning as an encouragement. The more common, this isn't a good reproduction sadly, more common articulation of humanists and their friends is these kind of ex libris markings. These are notes by a schoolboy where he says ex libris, Pierre Grillon and friends. So this belongs to Pierre Grillon and his friends. He will share liberally of his class notes. If you missed lecture on Virgil and other, or Ovid's Metamorphoses in this case, you can come to Pierre and copy the notes. The notes are not selected kinds of notes. These are notes taken under dictation. So they're probably pretty good. Here's another great sharer of notes, Nicolas Fabry de Peresque, who publishes next to nothing, but who amasses huge quantities of manuscript information, and who does so, as recounted by his biographer Pierre Gassendi. He always had helpers, copyists, ready to make copies in vernacular languages, Latin, Greek, Arabic, Turkish, or whatever language the occasion required. And he never tolerated the loss of any discovery or observation, however small. So animated he was by the hope that it could serve someone, himself or someone else. So that is the spirit of abundant note-taking, copying out everything, saving it, and distributing it as it comes in handy into your own letters, but also to help other people. So this idea that the humanists are all engaged together in a collective undertaking, which is carried out basically informally in these ways. By the late 17th century, we get an awareness among the late humanists of what they call libri sociales, social books, which are a new genre, Vincent Placius argues, and particularly born in the academies, which were, especially new in the 17th century. He does talk about their difficulties because of the dissension among men, and indeed he can think about many long-delayed social books that really took much longer than they might have taken if they'd been authored by fewer people. The dictionary of the Académie de la Crusca came out relatively promptly. The dictionary of the Académie Française took almost, over 60 years and only came out when it did in the late 17th century because it was being scooped by a one-author dictionary of the French language. So there's an example of social books being a complicated operation. A social book that's much earlier are the Coimbra commentaries of the Jesuits, where one author is on the name, is on the title page, Fonseca, but many, many Jesuits wrote them together. Of course, an ecclesiastical setting of religious order is a great environment for collaborative work. And collaborative work is certainly not new, even if the term social book is new in the 17th century. In the Middle Ages, the Dominicans are churning out biblical concordances or giant compilations as big as the ones of Zwinger, in the case of Vincent of Beauvais' Speculum Maius. And clerics are the greatest collaborators. They require no funding because they're prepaid, and they require no acknowledgement because they're doing it for the greater glory. Other examples, of course, these are both in the ecclesiastical domain, but Protestant. So these guys were paid, the King James and the Magdeburg Centuries, nicely studied by Tony Grafton, with a very hierarchically laid out way of dividing the labor. So this is a form of division of labor where everyone has a particular task according to their rank and their pay. Whereas this form of division of labor one could call more dynamic, where there were groups, I think 7 different teams, but each team was doing the same thing of translating a different chunk of the Bible. So these were, to use some modern parlance, sort of more dynamic collaboration where everybody could actually fill in for everyone else. Whereas here's a more static because everyone has a slot assigned to them. Another form of collaboration, well, there are certain kinds of books that are particularly collaborative. And in general, we need to remember, as Roger Stoddard has said in a way that wonderfully circulates in the internet and in book print too, authors don't make books, printers do, right? So there's always an engagement of the author with the people who make books. And certain kinds of books require more help than others. Maps, collections of any kind of illustration. And here is a very uniquely documented case of the contributors to the images of Leonard Fuchs's History of Plants. So he has a full-length portrait of himself on the verso of the title page, and at the end he's got this amazing set. This is, of course, a colored copy, which makes it extra nice. Of the three people who are responsible for making the pictures. Sketching from life, drawing it for carving, and actual carving. This guy seems to get pride of place in that particular hierarchy. I just want to note a couple other genres that I've noticed require a form of collaboration I had not expected. I've seen collections of poems where the author of the poems explains that he has these extra poems that he didn't put in the right place in the book because the people sent them in too late. But they're his poems. But the point is, they're poems he wrote for, to commemorate a special occasion. And he's asking for copies back from the people for whom he wrote them. So he didn't save, apparently, an outgoing copy. And in that sense, it becomes a collaborative book unexpectedly. Other strange forms of collaboration in bookmaking include a censor listing himself on the title page. So, of course, this is not a censor who's just saying you can't publish this. This is a censor who is modifying in order to make it pass muster. And then, of course, feels that he belongs there. This is a unique example that I came across in working on Theodor Zwinger, the Basel man of the Theatrum fame. And it's an epitaph recorded in a collection of epitaphs where we also have Zwinger's epitaph. But then we also have an epitaph for this most experienced typographical compositor who evidently died on the job, I would think, while composing the type for the Theatrum Humanae Vitae. And then this becomes recorded in a city cemetery in a different neighborhood from where Zwinger is living and passed on. So in that case, we get a little glimpse of someone who otherwise wouldn't be named or wouldn't be associated with the book because of his affiliation with this famous work of Basel. So I'm interested in, so I would just point out that Tony Grafton has a great book on culture of correction in Renaissance Europe, which goes into some examples of how we can get at other people who worked in the printing houses. And I look forward to, there's actually a whole lot of work being done by 16th century French literature specialists. A guy named Alain Riffaut talks about a spectrum. I mean, some authors engage closely with their printers, others don't, never set foot in the print shop. Sometimes a relationship with a printer is very close and amicable at first. For example, when the printer's trying to woo an author to print with him. And then once the book is printed, the printer drops the author. And the author has to come running, but the printer isn't interested anymore if it didn't sell well. Or on the contrary, an author like Erasmus, the printers seek them out. So obviously those relationships are highly variable. And a lot of good work's being done on them. So borrowing an expression from Stephen Shapin, the invisible technician, who here is talking about how Royal Society experiments were performed with instruments that were operated by people, but we don't know much about these people, aside from Robert Hooke, who had the formal curatorship of the instruments. And so much so that in this depiction, which is quite rare and why I've actually never seen the original book, I've had to use a copy from Steve Shapin's article. He's got cherubim depicting the people moving the instruments, turning the cranks, and so forth. So obviously, behind these cherubim are people, but they are supposed to be invisible, so we can't even see them as people. So borrowing from this idea, I'm interested in what I call invisible helpers. In particular, those who work most closely with humanists in those day-to-day operations. And even the terms for these helpers aren't clear. Amanuensis, secretary, and servant, famulus, is probably the most common term. So I'd argue that this is probably the norm of humanist life, is to have one or more servants, one or more of whom would be involved principally in intellectual labor, in scribing, in carrying out errands that might require more trust, taking messages, writing letters, indexing. Gadi Al-Ghazi has some excellent studies on the scholarly habitus in the 16th century, and he argues that the scholarly household emerges in a new way in this period as a result of the decline of the clerical life as the principal setting for scholarship. So we get scholarship happening outside religious orders on the one hand, and in the case of Protestants, we get scholars who can marry and who then, of course, have a different setup at home. So scholarly households with servants were only a small part of an overall increase in the number of households with servants in general in the 16th to 17th centuries, an increase driven by rising levels of consumption and social emulation, especially in urban contexts. Humanists actually typically married women from their environment, and often had children, sons especially, of course, whom they helped to train up in academic work, passing on a kind of habitus, passing on books and manuscripts, and habits of work. These norms were actually enforced by senior scholars in the field. So Conrad Gesner, for example, a Zurich compiler we've talked about a bit, he apparently married too young and below his station as far as his patrons were concerned, and they punished him by not giving him, the good jobs that he might have otherwise hoped to get. And so he spent much of his life complaining about his low salary as town physician in the city of Zurich, and publishing in order to make some extra money, because his wife turned out to be sickly, and he apparently had a difficult domestic life. But it seems partly to have been caused by his advisors, basically, who felt that not having followed their advice, Conrad Gesner wouldn't be rewarded as he might have expected. But of course, in many cases, so Gesner's offspring did not become humanists. However, Zwinger's did, Scaliger's, Vossius, Casaubon's, and so forth. There are many generations of scholarly families that go on for 2 or 3 even sometimes. So my purpose in talking about invisible helpers is, ideally, of course, we'd like to know exactly what they did. I can't say I can at this time very often. I have basically manuscript work, in a few cases, can show through different hands being present that multiple people, and typically the scholar with the messy handwriting and the amanuenses with very nice handwriting, can be identified. But really what I'm focusing on now is how collaboration was depicted or not in images, in writing, in manuscript, in print, and why and when these invisible helpers become visible. So in part, of course, it's a story of collaboration occulted, but I think it's also a more complex story in a way of competing models of scholarship. So in some cases, it's okay to acknowledge a helper, and in other cases, it isn't. In other cases, the scholar is alone, interacting with his sources, his books, his thoughts. And I'd like to try and figure out some of those choices and when they're made. So how to go about doing this? One thing I've done is to look in Igbo for amanuensis and variants. I got 79 hits and 58 books down to 1650. And the single most common usage is basically the amanuensis of the religious texts, of the divine text. So they are called the Penmen of Scriptures. Penmen actually gets a lot more hits than amanuensis, so that's another word on my list. Penmen of the Scriptures were the amanuenses, the secretaries of the Holy Ghost. So we have Solomon, Moses, the prophets, and the evangelists. So we have Matthew, amanuensis of the Holy Ghost. And then in the case of the Ten Commandments, one writer comments that in this case, the Scripture of Scriptures, in issuing them forth to the sons of men, God was pleased to become his own amanuensis. So in that case, God wrote directly. The Church Fathers, we hear about their amanuenses, and by then, of course, this is a real human relationship where some of them have names. This is a lovely image from an 11th century manuscript which actually depicts, so first of all, we have Gregory as Pope. But it depicts a story that was told after his death, starting with Paul the Deacon, considered a miracle, that while Gregory was dictating to and the guy is called excerptor, his discussion of the last vision of Ezekiel, a curtain was hanging between him and his scribe. And when the dictation stopped for a bit, the scribe was curious. And so he used his stylus, with which he's writing on the wax tablet otherwise, to poke a hole in the curtain and peek at what Gregory was doing. And then he saw the beautiful dove on his shoulder with his beak in Gregory's ear. The Holy Ghost is speaking to Gregory. When told of the scribe's indiscretion, Gregory swore his scribe to secrecy so that the miracle was recounted only after his death. So that accounts for this unique, I think, depiction of a relationship of a scholar working with his amanuensis. I don't know how common this idea of a curtain would be, if it's because Gregory knew he'd be in direct interaction with God and didn't want the scribe to see and therefore drew the curtain, or if this is normal, that this is how guys dictate, is through a curtain. You know, I look forward to your input on this. It's interesting that miracles surrounding dictation are also told of Aquinas, who reportedly was able to dictate to 3 or 4 secretaries at a time. This is also reported of Winston Churchill, without the miracle angle. So scribing, obviously, is the main thing that we associate with amanuenses, and I would argue that it's something that you can acknowledge hiring an amanuensis to do. Making a fair copy of a manuscript for printing is actually one of the things that people will acknowledge an amanuensis did for them. I think amanuenses did a lot more things. And it's interesting to consider what is the status of handwriting in this culture. On the one hand, handwriting is an important pedagogical tool. You saw those notes you've taken under dictation by children and enforced by teachers, and adults were expected to take notes and encouraged to do so. Note-taking is a form of discipline. It slows down the reading process. It helps you retain in the mind. On the other hand, there are medieval sort of strictures against excessive copying or taking dictation, as if copying too much is taking away time from better occupations. So that theology students were told they should copy only so much per day in medieval Paris, for example. So copying is something you do legitimately delegate. Oh, yeah. The scholar who discusses this, Eisler, actually talks about, has deciphered from his own mastery of Tironian notes, shorthand, he's decided this is that verse. I'm very impressed. So pass it on to you guys. So Erasmus is a wonderful case study of someone about whom we know a fair amount through his correspondence. He ran a household of up to 8 servants at a time. He was a Catholic cleric released from his monastic vows, but who remained unmarried, who had a female housekeeper for most of his life, but then he had many men who worked for him, from boys, pueri, who ran errands and copied, all the way up to his favorite 3, whom he had successively, for whom alone he reserved the term amanuensis, one of whom I'll talk about in more detail. So Erasmus, of course, also cultivates an image of himself in print and in commissioning these portraits of Hans Holbein, and he is always depicted alone and with his own works. Again, here. Or on his title page, he is interacting with the people humanists interact with, right? The ancients. And this, on the contrary, from the dust jacket of my book, is how you don't depict humanists. In fact, the hardback of my book has a little blurb about about the dust jacket image, and I don't say it's a satire. And for the paperback, actually for the paperback they changed it because I asked them to add that it's a satire. And this really, partly thinking about this project, brought home to me that you do not put a helper in a picture of a scholar if you aren't making fun of him. And you don't make a mess either. I am very heartened to know that he had a messy study, because mine is very messy. But I think that's only, people like us will think this is a good depiction of scholarship. This is a bad scholar. He's got a helper who is sitting on, you see, below the main guy, not wearing a hat. The scholar is in an armchair. The helper is on a stool. And these are all part of showing the social hierarchy involved in that relationship. But showing it at all is part of showing the seamy underbelly of scholarship that you shouldn't normally be seeing. So when do helpers become visible? And why are helpers so invisible? So it's a very hierarchical system where servants, of course, are taken for granted. And I do have some figures on the position of a secretary in a large noble household. He was of middling rank. So the top paid people would be the maitre d', and and the master of the stables is actually higher ranked than the secretary. The secretary is on a par with the cook, and he's above the valet, and all of them are above the porter, who's at the bottom. So obviously, in an environment where servants are taken for granted, you just ignore them. I mean, they don't really exist to the people who hire them. That would be one argument. I have another argument, though, too, which is that sometimes it's in the interest of the helper to make himself invisible. And the case that brought this to mind is that of the Italian humanist Pietro Vettori, who worked in with a group of students that included his son and his grandson when the latter was old enough. And the grandson is writing an eloge after the death of his grandfather, where he, who is especially well placed to know how the grandfather worked, claims that his grandfather, unlike most humanists, never worked with anyone except an amanuensis to make a clean copy for the printer. So that's allowable. And so here the helper is rendering himself invisible because, I suppose, as an offspring of the great man, he derives more glory from being associated with an even more glorious scholar because he worked alone, exceptionally, unlike most, than he would from saying, well, I actually did some things for him. So it brings to mind in general the phenomenon that Jack Stillinger has noted in The Myth of the Solitary Author, of the solitary genius, that often editors say of great authors will be the first people to deny that they did anything. And this is certainly true of Fitzgerald's editor, who said he didn't do anything to The Great Gatsby, and we know that he had all kinds of suggestions about building up characters, changing scenes, etc. But it's part of that relationship for the helper to be invisible. So partly it's the way they invisibilize themselves, I would say. But there are places where they become visible, and the classic one is to blame the helper. Of course, we've seen this today in plagiarism cases. Oh, it's the research assistant who caused this. Amanuenses are typically mentioned in print in order to bear the blame for some aspect of work for which the humanist wants to apologize. So Conrad Gesner, who you recall was very poor, and who we always thought worked alone, actually, in one line of his Bibliotheca Universalis, says, I won't deny that some arguments and chapters of books are explained more verbosely than I would have liked, but I entrusted that for the most part to the work of amanuenses, in the plural, and in other cases I would not have wanted to be more brief. So he's saying, well, sorry, some parts are long because I wanted them to be, and some parts are too long because I delegated this work to someone else, plural. So here's an impoverished man who's nonetheless working with people and presumably paying them. So that's part of what's impoverishing him, I suppose. Amanuenses are blamed for incompetence, ignorance, haste, and in general, back to the theme of the amanuenses as passing on religious texts, the errors of the amanuenses is a refrain in biblical criticism and basically a trope of religious controversy, too. And here they're talking not about the evangelists, who had it straight from the Holy Spirit and got it right, no one's denying that, but then the corruption by the human copyists, generation after generation. So just an example, we have a British author, an English author, formerly a Capuchin, who's now explaining that why you shouldn't be a Catholic, why you cannot trust the writings of the Church Fathers. He says, after a multitude of transcriptions passed since our Savior's time to us, how many faults and what alterations have been made in those books and in the doctrine of those fathers. For there is no man, however so able, who can brag that he can transcribe a sheet of paper without committing some one or more faults. How many will there be then in a great volume, as of St. Augustine or St. Chrysostom? And as those clerks or transcribers who were called amanuenses were for the most part mercenary and did everything for money and profit, living by that trade, it is likely they took not much care, but thought only upon a quick dispatch, that they might gain the more. And when they find anything that seemed a fault to them, whether it was really so or not, they changed and corrected it according to their mind and passion, it faring with faults as with balls of snow, which the more they're rolled, grow the bigger. So far was their faults to be lessened by their writers, etc., etc. And basically, we can't trust these texts at all. The problem is, of course, that could be said about other books like the Bible, but he's only saying it about the Church Fathers, which the Catholics rely on to excess. And that then becomes part of a polemical argument, that the errors of the amanuenses make these particular texts dangerous. So when is it? So here is a classic case of an edition that's been freed by the author from errors of the copyists. So their amanuenses are mentioned on a title page. Here's another, I haven't seen another one of these. I'd be grateful for others. This is a piece of paratext by an amanuensis to the reader. It comes in basically an piece of antiquarian scholarship that's a collection of medieval texts of English history, edited by Selden and Twisden. And so we have a To the Reader, which is by Twisden, and we have a To the Reader by Selden. And then at the end of the book, it's quite a long book, column 2003, whatever, 2768, we have an amanuensis to the reader, Radolf Jennings, about whom I haven't been able to find anything, where basically he's deflecting any potential blame. He's explaining that he took extreme care. He confronted the different versions of the manuscripts, he collated them, he proofread, and basically he's saying, don't blame me. But he's also getting his name in print here. And so it suggests, obviously he did a tremendous job too. We have the principal investigators, Selden and Twisden, who got this going, but Jennings, of course, probably ran, I would imagine, with other people under him, the operation of the actual work. Good. So just to go back to what are the things one can acknowledge having used an amanuensis for? So making clean copy. Another classic occurrence of the term amanuensis, I used an amanuensis. I am sent far away hence in great haste to my dear mother who's very sick, so I'm forced to dictate to an ill amanuensis. I don't think the amanuensis was sick. I think he's lousy, is the idea. So we have, I'm under time pressure, terribly sorry here, but I'm using an amanuensis. And of course, I'm already blaming him in advance for whatever it is he's going to do wrong. Occasionally, one sees an editor, or someone editing a posthumous work posthumously, who acknowledges the amanuensis, I think, in order to sort of develop the authenticity of the text. So here, for example, one R.D., signs only by his initials, who edited posthumously a manual for the directions of the sick and a manual of private devotions by Lancelot Andrews, the late Bishop of Winchester. He says, which I am rather induced to believe that it's authentic, not only by the internal arguments, the spirit and genius and method of and piety thereof, but also by the external testimony and conveyance of it to us as his under the fair hand of his amanuensis, from which, collated with another manuscript, I give you now corrected. So here the fact that he got it from the amanuensis is a guarantee of the authenticity of this manuscript. So those are sort of my examples of when amanuenses become visible as amanuenses. Here is a different, I'm going to read this to you, it's kind of long, a different example of how you would use an amanuensis. So Pontus de Thiard is a Burgundian nobleman, seigneur of Bissy-sur-Flay, and basically he moved in the court of Henry III for a while, was appointed Bishop of Salon-sur-Saône in 1578, and he retired to his family lands there. And we see this event taking place near the end of his life. But, well, not that bad, actually. He lives for another 15 years or so. He explains, I retired to my castle at La Salle near the end of summer with Philippe Robert, learned jurist, great connoisseur of Greek and Latin letters. And both of them worked on their work together. As evening was falling, Caumont, my secretary, came to see us, exulting. I have, my master, he said, looking at me, something that you could please add to your little work on the correct imposition of names, from which you have given me to transcribe. Here is a perdicite. This is one of these weird little stones that's supposed to grow in the beasts of birds, which I've pulled out with my own finger from the gullet of a partridge, which was served to us from the remains of your meal. Contemplating this kind of crystal, it seems odd that it would have been swallowed. I say with doubt, Comment, what game are you playing with us? And he, blushing a bit, excused himself. With all respect, I assure you that what I declared is the truth. If it isn't, master, henceforth do not believe me on any matter, divine or human. I split the gullet of that bird, came across this stone, removed it myself from the neck of the bird, which I then ate. Your chaplain, who's here in person, this valet, and the other domestics who saw this with their own eyes, I can bring them before you if you'd like. Give us this stone, I said. I believe you. You've convinced me. And I turned to Philippe Robert and said, I'm reminded of this passage in Elianus. And then he locked it in his jewelry case, And he's noticed that now its red tint has dissipated. So what is this? I mean, we get a glimpse of how these people work. The secretary works closely with the master, knows what he's working on, is understanding what he's copying, is interested in the topic. He eats from the leftovers of the master's meal separately with the other servants. And, but he does dare come into the master, running up and saying, here, here, I've got this great example. The master, of course, this is a classic example of how you portray an interaction with someone who's not from your social sphere. First of all, there are witnesses from the social sphere. We have the learned man who witnessed all this, Philippe Robert. We have a very detailed description of when and where this took place and exactly what happened and what was said. Of course, the servant is also bringing up witnesses to emphasize the authenticity of what he's saying. But I find that the tone in the end is a little distancing. This is what my servant told me. So the servant is being named. The servant didn't ask to be named, interestingly. The servant did ask that, would you please put it in your book? So it's the way many natural historians would describe an interaction with a fisherman or someone in the market from whom they are garnering information, and they will explain the circumstances of it without necessarily endorsing it as a piece of knowledge that they are creating. They're adopting it into making it available. Perhaps it's a reward to the secretary, but I find that Thiers isn't exactly agreeing that this is one of these. On the other hand, in the text itself is novum de perdicite. So there is a highlight, new tidbit, new example here of this kind of weird stone. So that's another kind of appearance of the amanuensis. We do have a couple of cases of lawsuits of an amanuensis to their master. The most famous one has been studied by Franck Lestringant, of a man named Mathurin Héré, who sues André Thévé. So he wanted to either have his name on the title page. He didn't get the name on the title page, but he did get financial compensation, and he got to stuff some clues as to his identity in the form of references to other works of his own in the book. So we see a tussle over acknowledgement in print, which ends not the way the secretary would want it, but he does get financial compensation. In another case, we see an author who is who's tarnishing the author's reputation by saying that actually the author who's taking the credit was just the secretary to someone else. So this is the case. De Thou is observing that P. Gillius was actually the person who had observed these fish, whereas Belon is taking the credit. But Belon was his amanuensis. My last example is the one that produced this great image. A unique case of an amanuensis who goes on to become a published author, and who can therefore use his, of course he wasn't any old person's amanuensis, he was Erasmus's amanuensis. This is Gilbert Kuzan, who worked with Erasmus from 1530 to 35. Erasmus lived one more year. And when Kuzan, who came from a good family, he was son of a magistrate in Nozeroy in Burgundy. So Kuzan studied law, then theology, and worked as a 26-year-old, I think. This is actually a 24-year-old. This is actually inaccurate, the statement here. For 5 years for Erasmus, but then when he was appointed canon in his home church of Nozeroy, he left Erasmus's employ. And Erasmus tried to retain him by, among other things, promising him a good share of any gifts that he, Erasmus, might receive, which gives us a sense, too, of how Erasmus is remunerated and how his amanuensis probably hadn't been remunerated until then. As it happens, then Erasmus put in a clause in his will for the next guy he hired, a faithfulness clause. If he stayed till his death, he'd get 200 pounds, which then took place. So Kuzan, having left Erasmus's employ, becomes basically, he's a cathedral canon. He also runs a small school where he mainly has sons of friends of his, humanists from Basel in particular, where he had very good connections. And this comes from a 30-page brochure published in Basel, which is quite rare, which is entitled, Songs in Praise of Erasmus and Kuzan. So it's mainly poems and this woodcut dated from 1553, which actually coincides with a big year for Kuzan, because he also published that year a description of Burgundy, his native province, which is heavily illustrated, including a picture. Let's see, I'll get you a picture. Oh, well, of his hometown. And the picture includes a map with where the Biblioteca of Gilbert Kuzan is. So he puts himself in his hometown in this book. So I think this is celebrating a big moment for Kuzan, as this is his major work. Kuzan was a polygrapher, wrote tons and tons of things, and then published them again in his opera Omnia, perhaps published as a favor to him by Operinus. So this is a very interesting depiction. Now, it's not a depiction by Erasmus, right? Erasmus is dead. It's a very egalitarian depiction. The secretary is in the same nice chair as Erasmus. They're both wearing hats. We do see, though, Erasmus is probably dictating and Kuzan is writing. And Erasmus, this is erroneous, Erasmus was 63 in that year because he was dead by the time he was 70. But yeah. Here is an example, not unfortunately in Kuzan's hand, but of one thing that Erasmus definitely did with an amanuensis, Nicholas Conius. Then we can see indexes, a manuscript of a printed index by Erasmus for the adages, which is being revised for a future edition of that index. And we can see Erasmus's hand, and we can see Conius's hand, the neat and the messy. This is studied by Tocci. Right, so there's a nice poem that accompanies that image, actually, where we see, so just as Kuzan was to Erasmus alive, so too in pious death, because one of the things Kuzan did was to collect adages, which he also published in his opera Omnia. That, in Erasmus' lifetime, was a labor of piety and endless study, and this a firm love of true religion. In the indexes of Kuzan, the opera Omnia of Erasmus, which Erasmus wrote here and there in various books, Kuzan makes everything, everyday things known. It's not, my translation isn't great, but frankly, the Latin isn't great either. It is a verse. So what's being described there, but being praised, is A, he takes dictation, and B, he made indexes. Kuzan depicts himself, depicts his device. So this is probably from Matthew, right? Prudent like the snake, humble or simple like the dove. And it's not only the snake and the dove, but also it's on top of a book. And the book is true doctrine. And it's on top of the rock, the bedrock of solid religion. Interesting to bear in mind that Kuzan was accused of heresy and died in prison, likely after he had been cleared of this accusation. And here we have a poem explaining the device of Kuzan with this whole business of the serpent, and so on. Right, there we have Nos Rois. This is another book that Kuzan published on the servant, how to be a good servant, and also for masters, how to hire a good servant. Sadly, there really isn't anything about the kind of intellectual service that I'm especially interested in. This is another. So these activities of making poems where every word begins with a certain letter, etc. Yeah, we go back to that. Good. Great. Well, I'm going to wrap up soon, I think, because I want to hear your comments. Just in closing, here are a few other. So the point is the amanuensis stands to gain from his association with the great person. And that's, of course, the relationship, especially in a family relationship. But here's an example of the hope that, this is advice by William Petty to Samuel Hartlib about how the amanuensis should work, especially in areas, transcribe things that will advance his own knowledge. Whether in practice that was so common, I don't know. Samuel Hartlib, first of all, did a lot of scribing himself, which is sort of unusual for one of these polygraphers, but he also hired many, many amanuenses, and he is the one who complained jealously that Marat Mersenne had all the charges relieved by the convent, whereas he, Samuel Hartlib, a Protestant, without the backdrop of a religious order, had to pay for his amanuenses. So I look forward to your comments in trying to elucidate the lives and activities of these invisible helpers. Thanks.
Just
Yes.
Yeah. I had a couple. One was the examples that you gave of people blaming the amanuenses. When it was Gesner, wasn't it, who was in fact poor? Would he be claiming amanuenses both to blame somebody else for the mistakes and to appear to be better off than he was?
That's an interesting thought.
That it works both ways.
Yes.
If you have a servant, you elevate yourself as well as the servant. The other question was the collection of historians. I didn't with the
yes.
amanuensis on the back page.
Right.
That seemed to be saying that the amanuensis had actually been doing the culling of the manuscripts.
Yes.
And that seems to me that's strikingly high level of assistance.
Well, I think in many of these cases, I would expect amanuenses to be doing high-level things. So we have things like Francis Bacon talking about how to hire a good clerk and to hire one who will take notes after your own mind. So you're actually sending them out there to read stuff and report back, to excerpt. Yes, and collating, I agree. I mean, so that's where what is acknowledged as amanuensis work and what's actually practiced, I think there's a range there. Most people, so here it's interesting that he really does put himself forward, obviously with the permission of those involved. Yeah, thank you. Please.
I will just briefly on Gregory's curtain from the dove. I don't know anything about that, but it does put me in mind of something Quintilian says about the benefits of giving dictation rather than writing in your own hand. Giving dictation is faster and more convenient, but it might make you uncomfortable because it's almost as if there's another person in the room with you. Which is actually an interesting example of the way, when you look at how the ancients talk about producing and using books, the slaves who are filling these roles are often conceived of as part of the technology, the way a tape player is part of tape technology, say. Now, obviously, that's easier to do when they're slaves, and there's a kind of conceptual framework for dehumanizing them. But is there a sense that the people who you don't see, have they disappeared into the machinery, as it were?
That's, of course, Steve Chapin's argument, right, that the cherubim are sort of, well, they've come from somewhere. That's a fascinating case. I mean, obviously, the secretaries themselves don't feel they've disappeared into the machinery. They have ambitions and self-consciousness. But I think that's right. From the master's perspective, of course, you become aware of them. Erasmus complains, of course, typically, right? He's robbed, or he catches two servants who were trying to rob him. He does have someone who makes off with his an annotation of a printed book and then ransoms it back, because, of course, if it's got the guy's annotations, he really wants it back. So, you know, again, that's always the negative. But the relationship, when it goes smoothly, is about being forgettable, is about being not noticed. Absolutely. So you only see it when there's a problem, when someone has misbehaved. And I agree. That's probably the first answer for why they're invisible, is because the masters don't see them. They're just part of the woodwork. Yeah. No, thank you.
What about household accounts?
Okay, that's a good question. I haven't delved into that at this time. But Erasmus's correspondence is, you know, does some of that, talking about hiring people, getting advice, and so forth. And we do have some things on Erasmus's household accounts, and I should look into that. So how much they were paid, for example, is what you're thinking?
Who all the servants were. I mean,
right.
I'm sure those will be few and far between, but they're, you know, even not of famous scholars, but of a kind of, you know, maybe even merchants.
Yep, that's a great idea. I should... I look forward to suggestions. I know we'll be able to follow up on individual households that might be promising. Thank you.
In that regard, getting records of the publishers.
Yes.
The whole museum,
Plantin is absolutely the place. Yes. So Tony Grafton talks about, what's his name, Puelen, who's their go-to guy, who does a lot of copying in-house and so forth, and that's a great, you know, sort of case study. We have some of his notebooks, so absolutely, the clean copy making that happens at the expense of the printer, or maybe at the expense of the author, but at the printer's shop, is clearly the work of someone like that. Thank you.
Yes, I was then wondering if there were situations in which the role of an editor and the role of amanuensis might sort of, I don't know, mingle. I'm thinking of collections of letters in particular. I've seen collections, printed collections of medical letters in which the author of the letter's son has taken the trouble to get all these things back and collect them, God knows, from write to people, that they've been sent to and gather them together. I mean, that's really I mean, it may be filial devotion, but it also sounds like amanuensis like drudgery.
Yes, edited volumes. Right. No, and collecting letters, of course, that's a good point. That's the kind of thing where you want the letters back, too, often, if you hadn't kept outgoing copies. That's a nice idea. Of course, that could be, the editor will typically end up on the title page.
Oh, yes. Yeah, with a lot of stuff about how loyal and filial and wonderful all this. Right. Yes. Right. And his own position and how he might carry on and handle the tradition of being a professor or whatever it was.
Yes. And I suppose part of the question is, what is the ambition of the editor versus, and so many of these guys, of course, don't end up on title pages. Yes, sometimes I have acknowledgments like a very skilled, learned young man, and so it's not even named, but it's being thanked for indexing, for merging two texts together, for alphabetizing. Thank you.
I wonder if you look at humanist dialogues as ways of acknowledging people. I was just thinking, as you were talking about Lipsius and his commentary earlier, Lipsius is the kind of new Erasmus who's doing it all on his own, but then you get his pupils, and I never thought about their kind of social status, whether you actually get servants as well as pupils who kind of butt in.
That's a great idea. Yeah, so obviously pupils and servants operate sometimes side by side, as we saw with the Vittori circles. And I'm sure your epigraphy specialists also work in teams. Yeah. So humanist dialogue would portray an interaction.
Well, Lipsius has some of his pupils ask questions of him, and I wonder if it's Lipsius's way of saying, we discussed it together and I get credit for it. But
right.
Or at least I get the money for the book.
Yes. That's a nice idea. And of course, certain people, the pupil is named, or it's a pupil. Yeah. You wouldn't have a. No, that's a great suggestion. The servant wouldn't be worthy of being in dialogue with a master like that, probably. Or would you think a distinction there?
They're looking at a statue, and they say, our servant Martin brought the thing in. And I think he's a guy who got these things for him, and that's why they name him.
Thank you. Oh, in the back.
You mentioned Bacon earlier. I've worked on Bacon's collaborations. I think he's interesting because at the beginning of his career, he is drafting things for the Earl of Essex, for example, which are quite clearly by Bacon, but under his name. By the end of his career, I think that other people are doing the same for Bacon. And I think that idea of people who can express his thoughts I think people were drafting what becomes Bacon's works, and all the manuscripts we have from that period are him correcting someone else's writing. That's so I don't know whether he's actually dictating and they're taking verbatim, or whether he's suggesting and then people are drafting. I think it's the latter.
Thank you very much. I mean, that brings up, there you're talking about creating new texts, probably, but absolutely that there are many texts that are created orally and then vetted by the master. I mean, that's how we have sermons and so forth. And so it is a process that the amanuensis is, a key player in that, even though the author sort of has final revising rights, I suppose. But that's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Lectures of academic lectures, too.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Your talk focused really on what we might consider works of scholarship history, as commentaries and dictionaries. I'm wondering if this sort of distinction we might draw between like a humanist amanuensis and a gentleman's secretary is a useful one, or if they overlap more, as sort of closely related forms of distributed writing.
No, that's a great question. Thank you. Obviously, the gentleman secretary, I think we most associate as sort of letter writing. But there, too, we'd have the issue of, is it taking dictation, or is it drafting something that the master will go over? I think there probably is, a range of practice there. And that would be a practice that probably humanists also might be using amanuenses for, in fact. There, obviously, the language might be an important difference, although the amanuensis, in the case of the gentleman, might be using Latin and, say, Greek, because the master can't. I don't know, versus the scholar's environment, where presumably everybody is working in both of those languages. And we saw, though, with Peresque, right, the amanuenses can do all those other languages, too. So Peresque may be relying on linguistic help from the amanuenses, too. But basically, my thought is that there's a lot of crossover between the different areas in which different modes of working. So between the merchant's world, which is clearly used as a model for note-taking, and someone like Bacon who talks about taking, modeling on the day book versus the register and so on. He says you should take notes too in the order in which you encounter them and then sort them, just as merchants do. Similarly, there's a lot of crossover, as someone like Bacon, between the scholarly world and the gentlemanly world. And I think maybe, well, Pontus du Stiard, for one thing, was a courtier in France. It was not just an English phenomenon. So it's probably hard to really separate them too much. And that would be the interest, really, is in seeing how techniques of making documents and saving them and sorting them differ by context. Because then archiving would be another angle to this, too. How do you keep documents and sort them? And you do that in a court environment. You do that in a scholarly environment. You do that in an ecclesiastical environment. There's probably a lot of carryover.
Well, just thinking again about lectures, the situations where a student takes down notes in London, goes back home to Switzerland, publishes the thing, as Professor Son knows in Professor Mercuriali's lectures. Mercuriali is enraged and has a favorite student, a new edition of his lectures. Now, neither of these people is, strictly speaking, amanuensis, but yeah.
No, that's a fascinating, I mean, obviously, right, unauthorized publication of the notes you took versus authorized publication. And the unauthorized, I think it behooves them to wait until the guy's dead. There are many posthumous publications of people's course notes, and who knows, of the lectures, who knows what the professor would have thought of what's being published. But by then, of course, it's an act of homage to the dead professor, and the student gets the glory. Of course. But yes, it's better to not have the guy around to give his feedback.
Actually, thinking about the universities, I was wondering how much you could use your students as research assistants, especially if many of them live in your house because you provided lodging for them, they ate with you.
Well, not with you, but of your food,
right?
Separately.
Yes, indeed. But so at what point did the student-professor relationship turn into an amanuensis?
Right. No, that's a great question. How would one be able to tell the difference? I mean, pay would be presumably because the student is paying the professor to live in his house and eat his food and get his wisdom, versus the amanuensis who's being paid. Of course, the student is upwardly mobile and will only be there for a time, whereas the amanuensis presumably, for some people, like Kuzan, it was a step on the way up, but for many people, and of course that was a disappointment to Erasmus, for many people it was a career choice, presumably. But of course they also work side by side, as we can see, so they're presumably doing similar things. So that's where the collegia, this idea of small groups who hang out with professors, who work with each other, and who may also lodge together at the professor's house, would be a good thing to delve into. But there's so many of them, and I'd have to choose. It seems to me I know about German ones, and I know about Italian ones. At the moment, those are the ones I know about. If you guys have other suggestions of how to get into that. But that's a great, I mean, what kinds of sources would they offer us? They would offer us manuscripts, presumably, if we're lucky, where we have multiple hands involved. But the problem is when you have these live relationships, you're living with someone, you're talking to them, that's not the kind of thing that leaves paper trail as much.
This memory of this student who is from Transylvania in Hungary, he's writing back to his patrons that the professor is trying to write history of Transylvania. Could you please send us some stuff?
Nice.
It could also, we could emphasize that my family is the most important.
You can get something out of it too. Wonderful, thank you. I look forward to following up. Thanks.
I was wondering whether there might be more consideration than before about when wives show up. It seems to me that there's, for one thing, there's of course a paper trail issue, but that seems to me there's also a hierarchical issue that's even stronger than the servant-master relationship.
Absolutely, thanks. And I should mention daughters too. Of course, there's Milton's daughters. That is the one case I've got where it's interesting how negatively it's portrayed, that they disliked it, right? That he trained them up to read to him in Latin and Greek, and the youngest one could even read languages apparently she didn't understand, but she could read the script, and she would read. And he liberated her from this at age 20. So this is at least one of the biographies of sort of a negative one. And then, of course, yeah, it gets. He was criticized, I think. So this is a theme that I'm hoping to develop a bit of how you treat your servants or your family members. When does this become a sign of your moral value or standing? I don't find a whole lot of that discussion with Erasmus, or Erasmus was quite vindictive, apparently, occasionally, with people he felt were abusing his trust or went too far. And of course, he had a lot of power, so he could say, if you publish so-and-so's work, I'm not publishing with you anymore. So that would effectively shut off publication for that, someone he wanted to turn against. So, although the notion that he's being vindictive, I don't know that that's not articulated by contemporaries. That's more of a historian's, looking back. So the wives. Yeah, the wives don't show up very often. And they do show up for things that are explicitly described in another book about how to index and so forth, about cutting up slips and so forth. And the whole point is, this is mechanical work. To alphabetize the slips is mechanical work. You can delegate it to. And then he actually mentioned servants. But of course, wives would easily fit in that. So there's the idea this is really low work, rather than excerpting or actually indexing, choosing headings. Just to be alphabetizing slips is the lowest and the most mechanical of these works, of these jobs. On the other hand, they do end up mentioned, which is amazing in a way in itself. Yeah. Thanks, Hal.
There really does seem to be a strong desire for the humanists to keep the helpers invisible. Is a part of that motivation due to the fact that if they became visible, they might have been hired away like others?
That's a great idea. I can imagine that there's a certain amount of, obviously there's a lot of letter recommendation writing happening in humanist correspondence about who will you recommend and so forth. I hadn't thought about bidding wars over amanuenses, but it's maybe not a bad idea. Thank you. Thank you.
But the reason for the suppression of their roles in the production of books is surely partly the desire to put the brand of the chief author on it, regardless of how the author himself felt about it. And Johnson is famously kind to his amanuenses and looks after them after he's hired them and gives them money. And this is seen as noblesse of a kind on his part. But it was just probably genuine. Whereas in some cases when they were promoted, people like Robert Shields, who did a biographical dictionary, it was attributed to Cibber, who was a well-known person. And then he had to fight with Cibber over the authorship, and Johnson came in on his side and said it was really Shields. So, but he never gave them any credit for doing any of the intellectual work on the dictionary, which I think, in fact, they must have done.
Yes. But you would put that decision with the publisher, really.
Yeah.
Who wants to make sure that the brand is sort of unadulterated.
Sure, and the promo for the dictionary, what it took 40 Frenchmen 40 years to do would take Johnson 3. There you have it, sir, the proportion.
Right.
All that kind of stuff. He clearly didn't believe any of that, but it was good PR. And then also, I wonder if you see there's sort of a rise of the amanuensis and an incorporation finally in Grub Street, where these people get their own due. and come out of the shadows. Some big project like the Universal History that funny charlatan Salmanazar worked on and wrote the history of the Jews, and, 800 pages, but never. Gradually, the knowledge that he did this was coming out, and gradually these people who lived in the shadows were getting paid more. But at the same time, this is curious that I think that at the same time there's also a greater kind of attention to the author as a figure, and the rise of the author. So it seems contradictory in a way that you should get both of them rising.
Well, there's so much rise of print in general that everybody can sort of rise. It's not a zero-sum game. That's a very good point about how it's not necessarily the author who cares about the brand. But with Erasmus, you do get the sense that there's an author who cared about his brand, although his publisher, no doubt, cared too. You're absolutely right. And there's this great new book by Alexander van Outgaarden about how Erasmus probably wrote a lot of the front matter, the paratext of Printer to the Reader, for his printer, because he wanted to elevate his printer, because that boosted him up, because he wanted to mimic Aldous, basically. And, Froben didn't really have the wherewithal to write the beautiful Latin that Aldous did, so Erasmus did it for him. And so it is, right, everybody can bootstrap and help everybody else go up. But it's true that the author has to be alone. I mean, so there's this, I think the 16th century doesn't get enough credit for a strong author function. I mean, a glorification of, it's not just the poets either. That's the thing. I mean, the self-crowned laureates, we all know that. But there are other branches where that's true too.
I was thinking, along those terms, thinking of the workshop of an artist, or the school of an artist, where, you have other people doing the background, but you did it, and you get the credit, because they're just part of the school. It's a cultural reason.
And how the artists' workshop often helped train you. The idea of having these people from early on is that they learned your style, and you didn't go get poached actually, or because you were going to be following the style of your master. So it was a lifelong. And I suppose you could move up the workshop. Is that the idea? And there'd be a hierarchy within it, although you'd never get the brand name, probably. Yeah. Thanks. I'm not a Thank you.
I'm just thinking of one 1630s manuscript from Newcastle where there's an indication where children are imitating the secretary's handwriting. And I'm wondering if you see any sense of a pedagogical side to the amanuensis' work, and if he is in turn working backwards.
Interesting. So the amanuensis might be a tutor sometimes. Yeah. I think that's a very likely scenario. I mean, he's the kind of person who could double as one, absolutely. And actually, Kuzan was a tutor before he worked for Erasmus. I mean, whether he's going to tutor and be amanuensis at the same time, he might have some, but that makes lots of sense. And the librarian, of course, is the other activity in a house. You could be all those intellectual letter writing, basically amanuensis, tutoring, and buying books and cataloging them. I like the idea of imitating the secretary's handwriting, because that's the idea that they have good handwriting. That's what you want to imitate. And there is this great observation by Paul Nellis about Gabriel Naudet, who was, of course, a librarian to a succession of French great noblemen, and great families. And he apparently, he had bad handwriting. And that's part of making sure he did library work and not the more, presumably, boring to him, taking dictation and so forth. So this play, the fine hand of the amanuensis is, whenever you want to praise the amanuensis, you talk about their fine hand. And of course, then there's the ill amanuensis, who's, the one you want to dump on. So having a good hand is obviously part of the job description, although you might get out of, if you're in a big enough place with enough division of labor, you could avoid the bad work by having bad handwriting. Thank you.
I think we have time for just one more question. If there's no more questions, then please join me in thanking